what I wanted to look at tonight, source criticism has been around for a good 150, 160 years. It really started to come into fruition in the 1850s with a lot of your German scholarship, and it has really flourished since then. Most of you have heard of the documentary hypothesis. This is going to play into scholars' reading of the text and how they understand it. So tonight what we're going to look at is the term ivri, used throughout the Pentateuch, the Torah, as well as particularly in 1 Samuel, because this is where we find the criticism of the text in particular. The two seminal works that we will be dealing with tonight. Oh, great to see you, Dave and Patty. Glad you guys could make it. So the two seminal works that we're going to be looking at tonight is Henry Casala's Hebrews and Mary Gray's the Apiru-Hebrew problem. And the reason this is a problem is because there are certain assumptions scholars make. You know, people that are religious are often accused of sniping ideas and sniping verses out of context. But what we're going to see in tonight's class is that scholars are just as culpable. They are just as good at sniping as anybody who bears a religious title by their name. So I'm going to go and start the slideshow. So here we go. Let me share this. And as soon as I see it up, we will continue on. So great. You could see you tonight, Betty. All right. So as soon as this pops up, okay, there we go. So this is going to be, we are dealing with the Appendix C simply because we are covering this material within the greater context of the Canaan conquest, and it was appropriate to deal with it here. So these are the assumptions that source criticism takes into the discussion of Ivri throughout the biblical text. First of all, like most religious people, scholars often consider a particular text in isolation without the context of other chapters and verses in the Bible. Now, many scholars see there being four primary authors of the Hebrew text. You have the Elohist, you have the Deuteronomist, you have the Yahwist, and then you have a redactor who redacted and added information in to make everything gel within the biblical text. Now, I am speaking what scholars currently hold today. There's lots of scholarship on these topics. The second point is that when you analyze a specific text based on the documentary hypothesis, scholars usually will only deal with those texts that are identified being authored by one particular author, and they'll ignore it. So if a Yahwist section, if information within a Yahwist section also files within an Elohist section, they're not going to be compared because they are assumed to be two different authors. Forget the fact that they may be talking about the same event or being given compatible information to the same event. They're really just ignored. The other things that are always ignored are other books of the Bible because they are not relevant to that particular chapter and verse in discussion. Discussions of the Canaan conquest. Samuel is not always drawn into the book of, the book of Judges. I have here on my slideshow Joshua. This should actually be Joshua and Judges because both of those books are ignored. So what happens when we find with Joshua, with Samuel, is that when we get into the chronology of the Judges era and we come into Samuel, I'm actually going to look this up here real quick. We find that Samuel and Eli are actually contemporary with some of the judges during this era. So let me look this up. This is going to be, yes. So Samuel is going to be contemporary with around 1139 when there's captivity to the Ammonites and Philistines. and then later on they are delivered by Tola. So you have Isban of Bethlehem, you have Elon, and then you have Edon, so Abdon. So you find that Samuel is contemporary with about the last 3 or 4 judges of this time period. That is the way the chronology breaks down. So, but for the most scholars will ignore the fact that Samuel was indeed contemporary, and so was Eli, with some of these later judges. The fourth assumption, that discussions of not really the documentary hypothesis, but of discussions of the Ivri in general, is that they take a 1250 BCE Exodus date. Now, when you look at the Exodus date being this late, it presents incredible contradiction and incredible anachronisms where Ivri, Hebrews, are used throughout the ancient Near East and throughout the biblical text. This is because we find that there are Hebrews, Ivri, or Apiru, within the land of Canaan from as early as about 1450 BCE. So this is 200 years before scholars assign the Exodus. We find Hebrews in Egypt before the supposed Exodus date of 1250 BCE. We also find them throughout Mesopotamia and Mari and Ugarit. So this presents an anachronism, and it requires some sort of justification on part of the scholar. So what we are going to look at today is what is considered the seminal discussion that totally nullifies the Hebrews, the Ivri, being Israelites within the Hebrew text. So we're not looking really at ancient Near Eastern sources or any of that tonight. We are strictly sticking with the biblical text, because this is what supposedly proves that the Ivri are not Israelites. Yes, I know some of you are probably shaking your heads, but bear with this. So this is the pretty much the summary. This first text that we're going to look at is the summary of the scholarly consensus. I do have the citation in the lower corner, and this is Henry Cazal's. And hold on, I'm going to take a drink here real quick. This is Mr. Cazala's summary of the problem of the Ivri in 1 Samuel. Now, 1 Samuel, just as a background, is attributed, number 1, to the Deuteronomist. So in other words, the ideology that is expressed resonates with both the book of Deuteronomy, with parts of the book of Samuel, with the book of Jeremiah. All of those books are identified as being, first of all, written by the Deuteronomist, and then secondly, there was a redactor. There's like a redactor 1 and a redactor 2 that come in and make everything more cogent and more cozy, so everything fits together. That is a scholarly consensus. But as we're going to see tonight, there's really no need for any of those side justifications, because if we read the Hebrew text in context, it really makes sense. And there's really no need for justification. So what does the Hebrew text tell us in regard to the Ivri? This is the scholarly consensus as opined by Henry Cazales. And he states, 1 Samuel 14:21 concerns the Hebrews who had been with the Philistines before that time. And that is a quote from 1 Samuel 14:21. It says, and the Israelites who were fighting with Saul and Jonathan. The Hebrews changed sides and joined the Israelites. In the previous chapters, verses 13:6 and 7, Hebrews and Israelites had taken different attitudes towards the Philistine army. The Israelites stayed where they were, even though they had to hide themselves in caves, among bushes and rocks, while the Hebrews crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Finally, there is 1 Samuel 13:3, where the distinction is less clear. The text as we have it has perhaps been edited under the influence of the identification between Israelites and Ivri. Saul wishes to let all the Hebrews, the Ivri, know of the victory of Jonathan over the Philistines. He also tries to attract the side of the Israelites who had become odious to the Philistines, a more numerous following. So what we're going to see is that a lot of Cazella's opinions, a lot of his conclusions are indeed justified by the text. But the ultimate question that we have to ask ourselves is that if there had been a large group or a large number of the Hebrews who had been with the Philistines before we get to 1 Samuel 14, does this mean that they were not Israelites? So this is a question that Gonzalez and another scholar, Mary Gray, she also, as I mentioned before, has a seminal work on this topic. And they really never asked that particular question. So we're going to kind of delve into that tonight. And this is important. And then one of the reasons that I'm covering this tonight is because when you go out and you have a discussion with someone who is familiar with this topic, you are going to hear from everyone that the Amarna letters have nothing to do with the Israelites. You're going to hear that the Hebrews that are mentioned in the Amarna letters have nothing to do with the Israelites. And then you come down to the fact that the Hebrews in the book of Samuel, and perhaps even within the Torah, have nothing to do with the Israelites. So this is the question we want to be very firm on when we're discussing these topics. So this is, we're going to start back to some of the first descriptions of Ivri within the book of Samuel. So this takes us all the way back to 1 Samuel 4, verses 5 and 6. This is where Israel had fought with the Philistines, and this is when Eli was the high priest, and Israel brought the Ark of the Covenant into the camp of Israel, thinking that there would be some sort of mystical power in the ark, and having the ark there in their camp would give them some sort of power and victory over their enemies. Israel really did not consider the fact that the covenant was a constitution, that rather you had to follow the stipulations in order to be strong, because it was the stipulations themselves that strengthen you. Rather, Israel saw it as a device that had some sort of mystical power, kind of an amulet. But this is the account in 1 Samuel 4, verses 5 through 6, that refers to both Israel and Ivri, or Hebrews. It says, "And when the ark of the covenant of YHWH came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth rang again. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, 'What means the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews?'" Or the Hebrews. And they understood that the ark of Yahweh was come into the camp. So if this is some sort of original text and then a later redaction or a later editing, the original text here is viewed to be what the Philistines stated. They stated that there was a great shout in the camp of the Hebrews. Now, the issue with source criticism in this verse is that nowhere in Scripture, Genesis through Malachi, or nowhere in any other writings throughout history, whether we look at Egypt, we really don't have a lot of history of Israel outside of Egypt, but no other group of people had control or ownership or power over the Ark of the Covenant other than the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, and by extension, the Hebrews. So, this is a question, is this splitting hairs as to whether or not a later redactor said all Israel, or whether it is Hebrews? Whether we look at Israel or the Hebrews, they both have control of the Ark of the Covenant. And this particular text, it identifies the camp of the Hebrews as being part of the greater Israel congregation. So we find that the Ark of the Covenant comes into the Israelite camp. As we all know, the Philistines end up winning this particular battle. They take the Ark as a booty of war, and it travels around from city to city. Wherever the Ark goes, There is destruction inflicted on the gods of the Philistines wherever the ark goes among the Philistine towns, cities, and villages. Now, so again, just to recap real quick, 1 Samuel does use all of Israel and is comprised of the Hebrew camp. Nothing in these verses suggests that the Hebrews were a distinct group or entity that were separate from the greater congregation of Israel. Now, again, we find, we're going to go down to verses 7 and 9. And the Philistines, again, refer to the Israelites not as Israelites, but again as Ivri, or Hebrews. This is again 1 Samuel 4, verses 7 and 9. And the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God has come into the camp. Be strong and quit yourselves like men, O you Philistines, that you be not servants to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Quit yourselves like men and fight. So what you find throughout the Judges era is you find that when Israel is obedient to the covenant, they prevail, and all of the territories around where they are living and the territories they have managed to conquer and actually control, the cities and villages within their territory pay tribute to the Hebrews. And then a lot of the people of those villages become servants, not only monetarily, but there is often a tribute given of servants as slaves or as bondmen to the Hebrews for several generations. So this, again, it's a question of who is going to prevail, you know, kind of the adage of survival of the fittest, who at this point in time is going to prevail, to be the victor, and who is going to be the vassal at this point in time. But does the fact that the Philistines do not refer to the Israelites as Israelites, it use an ethnic designation, does this compromise the integrity of the fact that they were Israelites? Well, one thing that we have to occur right around this time, this would have been right around 1128 BCE, according to the chronology that is reconstructed from the Judges era. You find that 1 Samuel 4 occurs about 50 to 70 years before the monarchy is established. There really would have been no reason for the Philistines to have recognized Israel anything other than an ethnic group. The kingdom of Israel, which would have been a dynastic designation, does not occur later in history. So rather than showing redaction and rather than showing something that is anachronistic, what we are seeing with the Philistine statements is the development and the progression of Israel from a tribal confederation into an actual thriving kingdom such as Egypt or Assyria. So this actually grants validity to the text when we are looking at those particular issues. Now, this is another text that plays into the greater understanding of the term Habiru, and we'll deal with this in just a moment. Let's look at this text first. This is 1 Samuel 13, 2 through 4. Now we are coming into the point where Saul has been established as king over Israel. He has been on the throne about 2 years, and he begins a campaign against the Philistines. And I say he begins the campaign. He actually inherited the campaign because Samuel had actually begun the campaign to drive the Philistines out of the Israelite territory about 14 to 20 years prior to Saul inheriting this campaign. Samuel had reclaimed about 21 cities that the Philistines had captured under Eli, and Samuel was making incredible progress. In the course of Samuel's campaigns, Israel say, you know, we're really tired of this. We want a king. So they gather at Mizpah, which would have been on the very northeastern side of Israel's territory. And the reason Israel did this is because the land was turbulent. The Philistines could have attacked any group at any time. So there really was no safe place. Shiloh had been forsaken, the place where YHWH had formerly placed his name. and it was not a safe place for Israel to convene for any of the holy days. So rather than convening in Shechem or Shiloh, they retreated quite a ways northeast to a territory that was safer and was protected on the northern side and was out of the foray of Philistine aggression. Now, you find that at this particular point in time, this also would have been when Japheth would have been with Israel and when he would have been leading Israel during the initial gatherings at Mizpah. As we go on, Israel asks for a king, and there's about a 7-year interim between Israel asking for a king, the time that Saul is chosen, and between him being established on Israel's throne. So there was that 7-year period. Saul comes to the throne right around, let me look this up real quick. Okay, so Saul is established on the throne right around 1058 is when Saul is established on the throne. So Samuel was very old. He was well into his 80s at this point in time, perhaps even as old as 90. And Saul, the kingdom of Israel is 2 years old. So now when we come into 1 Samuel 13, verse 2, we read about some very particular campaigns that both Saul and Jonathan wore within the land of Israel. So this is the text. Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereof 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. And the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Gibeah, and the Philistines heard of it. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, Let the Hebrews hear. And all Israel heard that Saul had smitten the garrison of Philistines, and Israel was also held an abomination with the Philistines. And the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. Now, a couple points bear mentioning in this text, because this really has a lot of information. First of all, we find that Saul and Jonathan took different regiments in 2 different directions for 2 different purposes. We also find that that Saul blew a trumpet. You know, there is a command within the within Numbers for blowing the trumpet during a time of war in order to call the people together. And Saul actually follows this command, and he blows the trumpet in an effort to draw the men of war to him and to follow him. So this is not, who is he calling? Well, he's calling the Hebrews. And again, there's this interplay between Hebrews in verse 3 and Israel in verse 4. Whether this is just a variation of language is one possibility. It is possible that it is the hand of a later redactor. But does that hand of a later redactor compromise the fact that we are still talking about Hebrews in the context of 1 Samuel 13? And that is a question we're going to continue to investigate. Now, it says that the Israel was held as an abomination to the Philistines. The term here really means they were odious. They were something that were considered just horrible. They were detested. They were hated by the Philistines. You know, within the broader corpus of Apiru discussion, in other words, when we look at the Apiru in Mesopotamia, mentions or references to the Apiru in Egypt and Ugarit, you find in not all of the texts, but you find in many of these texts that the Apiru are mentioned with disdain. The Apiru are often kind of warmongers almost, where they will attack people in outlying territories and they will conquer. These would not have been Israelites in Mesopotamia. Some of these occur as early as 1800 BCE, some of them at 17 and 1500 BCE. This is going on in Mesopotamia, while Israel is in both in Egypt and in Israel. So these would not have been Israelites. But you find that there is this connotation in many of these texts where the Apiru are seen as odious to the native citizens of whatever particular land they are living in. In this particular text, just looking at this in the biblical context, you find that when you attack a people, when you destroy them, when you kill them, when you kill some of their soldiers, you kill some of their citizens, there is a natural hatred that occurs because of that conflict. For us today, if we look at America, many of the terrorists that attacked the Twin Towers in 9/11 have become odious to Americans. Terrorist is a very has a bad connotation to it. Same thing for the people of France. With all the terrorist activities that have occurred there, Islamic terrorists are odious to the natives of the land because there is death and destruction. Really, the Israelites or the Hebrews would have been considered in the same context because they had attacked and because they had smitten the Philistines at that particular outpost where they were stationed. So that is both the macro as well as the micro view of the Hebrews and the reasons for why they were odious right around, actually it would have been as early as 1800 BC all the way down to right around 1050 BCE. Now we also find, let me get my slide to advance here, okay. Just to overview real quick, ancient Near Eastern texts often use the term Apiru to describe people who become migratory. These migratory people were often troublemakers. So why are they troublemakers? Well, if they don't have a homeland or they are fleeing a homeland, they're trying to establish a new homeland. They don't always want to assimilate into the native culture. Rather, they want to keep their own culture, their own identity. So there is conflict with this because there's competition for land resources. There's competition for trade. There's competition for slaves, for tribute. And there's also competition as to whose culture will prevail. We think of these sometimes in modern terms. These are really issues that the world has been grappling with for longer than 3,000 years. But anytime a group becomes migratory, they often become troublemakers. The other thing that you find is that when Saul attacked the Philistine garrison, it did make Israel despised. And sorry for the background noise. My kids are making dinner tonight, and it sounds like they're having a lot of fun in there. So number 3, were the Hebrews separate from the Israelites who also became a source of offense? And that is the other point that scholars will often point out. They'll say that, even though the Hebrews attacked, that Israel also became odious. So the Hebrew would have naturally have been odious because that was the connotation of who they were as either an ethnic, linguistic, or some sort of renegade designation of population, and there was this natural connotation of them being odious. But in where we have in 1 Samuel 13, there's the connotation that the Israel also became odious. This is the way that scholars spin this text. So the question that we have to answer in this text is, were the Hebrews a separate entity? Did Israel also become odious because of this attack? Or were they both the same designation and both became odious because of the attack? So those are some questions that we'll look at as we continue this discussion. Notice that, point 4 here, notice that as we enter into verses 6 through 8 of chapter 13, Saul had sent the Hebrews to their homes and tents. And he and Jonathan took only about 3,000 men. I think I have 4,000, but I believe it was 3,000. The other thing that we find is that after Israel attacks the garrison, you find that the battle is initially goes in Israel's favor. But very soon, the battle turns in the favor of the Philistines, and the Apiru have to retreat. So this is going to be 1 Samuel 13, 6 through 8. We're going to go ahead and read this. It says, when the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. And some of the Hebrews went over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. And he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. Well, there's several points. So this is what scholars argue concerning this text. They say that Saul took one group of men and that the Israelites followed him. Another group of people, the Hebrews, they were dispersed from Saul. They fled. They hid in thickets and in caves. And they see these two separate groups as having two different allegiances. The Hebrews are really simply a renegade group of people who really have no allegiance other to themselves and their own self-interest, whereas Saul is leading the Israelites. Again, scholars do not see the Hebrews in this particular text as being Israelites. So let's look at this within the biblical context and see if that can clear up any of these questions. First of all, we find that the battle turned against Israel and that the people fled and hid in caves, at least part of them. Now, this is what's interesting, and this is the part of the equation that most scholars overlook. Where did the Hebrews retreat? Where did they go when they hide? It says that in verse 7 that they went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Well, you find that the territory of Gad was an Israelite territory on the other side of Jordan. It was a possession of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. So had these Hebrews retreated someplace to the north or someplace to the coast, someplace that we know was not an Israelite possession, scholars may have a valid point. But in this particular case, they did not. They retreated to Israelite territories where they would have been able to resupply, where they would have had villages that would have protected them against Philistine aggression. Part of the people followed Saul. You find that some were afraid and some were not. So, and you often find this in a lot of different wars throughout history, where part of the army retreats and part of them stays the course, depending upon the commander of those particular regiments and depending on how the battle fares in that particular area. You know, part of the army may succeed where part of it is disbanded. So, going to review here for a moment. Casella's analysis ignores the distribution of land in Deuteronomy and in Joshua when considering the retreat. The men of Israel were losing a key battle. Some of them fled. Some of the regiments followed Saul. Others fled from the enemy. And then the question is, does a retreat make them two separate groups of people? Do we have any evidences or any circumstances in history where you have one army or one nation retreating and one of them staying the course and continuing the battle? I don't know of any historian or any scholar that would really posit that one part of the army retreating and another part continuing the battle makes them two separate nations or two separate groups of people. So I think that some of these are really stretching the limits of what it meant to be Apiru at this point in time in this particular context. Now, this is another battle. Remember, it said earlier that Saul had taken one group of people and Jonathan another. Well, now we come to 1 Samuel 14, which is the point of Casalis's contention. So we find that in another battle, Jonathan, who's Saul's son, and his armor bearer attack another Philistine garrison. According to 1 Samuel 14:11, the Philistines refer to Jonathan and his bearer as Hebrews when the duo challenged them. And this is the exact text. It says, both of them discovered themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, behold, the Hebrews come forth out of the holes where they had hid themselves. Now notice that in every single point where we have the voice of the Philistines, Israel is always referred to Hebrews. They are never referred to Israelites by the Philistines at this point in time. And this would be something that would be very historical because, again, the kingdom of Israel at this point in time is only 2 years old. It has not had a chance to establish itself as an entity that is anything more than a tribal confederation. All right, so continuing on, although Jonathan was a Benjamite who may have been dressed as an Israelite prince, the Philistines thought him to be a Hebrew or Apiru. Remember, Apiru was the term that Egypt, Assyria, Ugarit, and Canaan used to identify the Israelites during the Amarna period. And this name continues to be used by Egypt well into the reign of Ramesses. It's actually even later than 1275 BCE. So one thing that I found was interesting in this text is that the Philistines state that when they saw, the moment they saw Jonathan, they automatically knew he was an Apiru or a Hebrew. How did they know this? So this is the question that I posit. Perhaps Jonathan, as a Hebrew prince, was wearing the fringes of blue and red that had been commanded in Numbers 15:38. Remember, we looked at this last time as the designation of dress that we see from Asiatics from Canaan during the Amarna period and a little bit later. The question is, are these really Israelites? Are these really Hebrews that we are looking in this context? So that's a question that I don't think we can answer for sure, but it is certainly a possibility we cannot ignore. So now we come into the new kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. You find that during the Judges era, Israel had been known as Hebrews. They had been also known as Shashu, who would have been kind of migratory type Bedouins that really did not have a home. And we find several instances. We're going to really look at this in greater detail in our next class. But you find that throughout the Judges period, that Israelites who had not conquered their tribal inheritance continued to live in temporary dwellings such as tents. We find this in, sorry for the typo here, but it's Joshua 3:14. You also find Joshua 22 verse 6, and then Judges 4:11 and 20 through 21. We find Israelites living in tents, or we find people that are confederate with the Israelites living in tents. So unless a particular tribe had secured their homeland by driving out the natives of that particular swath of territory, only then did they build houses and inhabit them. If you were, for instance, say a person from Zebulun, but yet you were still living in Manasseh's territory, you were going to be in a temporary dwelling. You were going to be in a tent because you were living within your brother's land. You had not yet established your land and your inheritance for your children and your posterity within your land. So this very much fits both the Egyptian, or rather the Egyptian designation as part of the Israelite tribes being Shashu. Part of them would have been more landed, and they would have been more established within the territory. Again, just to reiterate the point that the monarchy was only 2 years old, and the Philistines would not have recognized Israel as a formal kingdom. They still would have seen them as an ethnic tribal confederation. The other thing that we need to consider as we go into the discussion of 1 Samuel 14, verse 1, and remember this was Casalis's main point of contention. Let me grab a drink here real quick. The main point of contention is that many of the Israelites during this period of time had been with the Philistines. The text indicates that the Hebrews had been joined with the Philistines, and many of them may have even been warring against Israel. So this is really the crux of the entire issue. But the controversy and the apparent contradiction really eases when we consider Israel's history within other books of scripture. So what we find in Judges 1, and you've seen me quote these texts in several classes, and I want you guys to see these texts in many different contexts, because they provide a very important understanding, overall understanding for Israel's history during the Judges era. So what we find is that very early, this is probably right around 1460 BCE, when Joshua has died, Caleb has died, and then you have the elders that outlived Joshua. They are passing away. So you have a new generation that has not seen all the wonders that God has done in Egypt. They did not walk through the parting of the Red Sea. That was their grandparents that did this. So this is a new generation. They're striking out on their own, and they really establish a new policy with dealing with the Canaanites and the Philistines. And this is what Judges 1:21 testifies. It says, "And the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites that inhabited Jerusalem, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem unto this day." So what this means is that if they are dwelling together, if they are living together, they're living together peaceably. They're not warring together. Israel, as the stronger entity at this point in time, would have offered the Jebusites and any of the other tribes in the surrounding territories, would have offered them suzerainty treaties whereby they would live in the land. Benjamin would have offered protection to any warring outside entity in exchange for a large sum of tribute. So Israel is getting very wealthy. The Hebrews are getting wealthy during the early years of the Judges era. Now, coming into the text in the verse in context, this is what 1 Samuel 14:21 and 22 state. "Moreover, the Hebrews that were with the Philistines before that time, which went up with them to the camp from the country round about, even they also turned to be with the Israelites that were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, all the men of Israel which had hid themselves in Mount Ephraim, when they had heard the Philistines fled, even they also followed hard after them in battle." So what we have in this text are possibly three different groups of Hebrews. You have the first group of Hebrews that had been confederate with the Philistines. You also have a second group of Hebrews in verse 22 who had hid themselves from the previous campaign where Saul had attacked the Philistine garrison in Gilead. And then you have the third group who had hid themselves in the rocks and in the caves, who, when they heard that Israel was prevailing, all three of these groups joined forces together to finally chase the Philistines out of the highlands, and to really establish a firm territory that we can now designate as Israelite, and something that the Philistines are never going to again attack, and they're not going to come into this territory and fight against Israel until very late in the Israel's monarchy, like right around right before Nebuchadnezzar deports the nation. So this is a parallel account that we have in 1 Samuel 14:21. It is really informed by Judges 127. Now, Judges 127, as I mentioned before, occurs probably about 300 years prior, around 1460 BCE, where we find that neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean or her towns, or Tanakh and her towns, nor the inhabitants of Dor and her towns. And we're going to skip down to the italicized area. And it came to pass when Israel was strong that they put the Canaanites to tribute and did not utterly drive them out. Neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites that dwell in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. So this is what we are finding. The portion that we are finding in 1 Samuel deals with Manasseh's territories. We are told that Manasseh did not drive out the Canaanites or the Philistines, and Scripture uses the idea of Canaanites and Philistines interchangeably, seeing them as both natives of the land and really not as separate groups per se. So you find that the Canaanites, Philistines, lived among the Israelites. They paid tribute to the Israelites, and they dwelt with peace among them, just as it states in 1 Samuel 4:21. This does not mean that they are a separate group, void of Israelite affiliation or ethnicity. It's simply that they are scattered groups within the tribal federation that have different policies in different territories where Israel has settled. Now we find this very important verse in Judges 2, verses 1 through 3. And this is where the angel of God comes to from Gilgal to Bochum, and he rebukes Israel for having offered covenants to the natives of the land. And the particular consternation is, and you shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. You shall throw down their altars. Why have you not obeyed my voice? Why have you not done this? So God rebukes Israel for offering these treaties to the natives of the land, because of the fact that it becomes a thorn in their side. Their gods become a snare to them, and Israel becomes very weak. When you allow the people to live among you, you begin to assimilate, and you begin to adapt practices that harm you. Many of the cults, as you well know, within the land of Canaan had purification rites that include sexual purification. Oftentimes that meant that you had to sleep with a priest. So you had a lot of these very perverse practices and customs within the Canaanite culture that spread disease. They did not eat clean. So all of this was a snare to Israel, and it took them away from the constitutional precepts that made Israel so strong that no one would have wanted Israel's territory, and people would have fled before them because they would have feared Israel. So now we're going to look just very briefly of the term Ivri throughout Scripture. And what you find is that the term really means fellow countrymen. It is an ethnic, perhaps linguistic designation that we find for the people of Israel. So what are some of the terms that we have that refer to Israel's population? Ivri occurs about 34 times in the Torah and 1 Samuel. The term Israelite is used about 18 times, 4 of them in the Torah. The people of Israel is used about 400 times, and the children of Israel, sorry again for that typo, 630 times. So you find that early in Israel's history, when they come into the promised land in the Judges era, you find that Ivri is used more often. As Israel comes into the kingdom era, right around 1150 BCE, you find that the term after 1 Samuel drops into disuse. Not only does it drop into disuse within the land of Canaan, it also drops into disuse in Egypt, in Mari, in Mesopotamia. So this is just a phenomenon where this particular term is no longer used. The term Ivri is replaced by the term Israelite, but more often it is replaced by the term people of Israel or children of Israel. So the term children of Israel is the recognition of an administration of a formal kingdom that is being formed right around 1050 BCE. So Hebrews in Egypt circa 1620, and these are scriptural sources. On the left of this particular slide, you will see that the midwives, that Pharaoh says to the midwives, and he refers to them as Hebrew women, referring to a Hebrew woman who gives birth as having a different ability of giving birth than an Egyptian or, say, a Nubian, refers to an ethnicity, a racial trait that the Egyptians did not have. In the second verse listed there on the left of the slide, you find that Moses goes among his brethren, and that it is the brethren of the Hebrews that are referred to as Israelite. This again is a reference to a family, an ethnic or racial designation for the term Ivri. So nothing in scripture makes the term Ivri simply a wanton group of troublemakers or a migratory group. Rather, the Ivri are seen as a tribal racial ethnicity, something that binds them together within the greater corpus of Israel. And so we're going to go ahead and recap and close the class down. We have 2 pages of conclusions we're going to look at real quick. The Hebrews were a different ethnic group than the Egyptians in Egypt right around 1620. Israel had offered peace treaties to the Philistines, Canaanites, in exchange for tribute. The Hebrews, who are identified as part of all Israel in the camp when the wars against the Philistines under priest Eli. In other words, even though you have Hebrews in the camp, they are still identified as the greater corpus of all Israel. And there was no other people within the land of Canaan that had control of the Ark of the Covenant. The Hebrews and / Israelites were the only entity that had power or controlled that Ark of the Covenant until it was captured by the Philistines. The 4th point, Hebrews, specifically the tribe of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, were allotted the land where Saul's attack on the Philistine garrison took place. Hebrews had been in Saul's camp. The battle soured, and some of Saul's Ivri regiments retreated into caves. When the battle turns to Israel's favor, those Ivri families or tribes who had made peace with the Philistines and Canaanites switch sides to fight with their brethren, the Israelites. So when we look at these in context, we really do not find anything that prohibits or is an obstacle for the Israelites also being Ivri. They have the same shared history. They have the same circumstances that occurs for both of them. So whether we look at the Ivri in isolation or within the larger scriptural context, there is no contradiction. And I would say that the ideas that are espoused within source criticism really do a disfavor by sniping particular text out of context and not looking at the overall context from Exodus through 1 Samuel. Because when we look at those, we find that they tell the same story. They tell the same history. And there's one connotation of the term Ivri within the biblical context. So that concludes the class for tonight. Any questions or comments? I'm going to open it up. You all have about a minute lag from what I am saying, so I'm just going to ramble on for a moment, give you guys a chance to respond. And I did not see if Ross posted there would be a class tomorrow. If you guys want to fill me in on that, that would be great. I have been running very, very busy today We are getting back into the school mode and just doing a lot of multitasking going on around this neck of the woods. Thank you, David. I appreciate that. And it's great to see you guys here tonight. So any questions or comments? If not, I will shut the class down. It has been fantastic having you guys here. And please like and share. And now next week, let me clarify this. There will be no class next week. I am taking the week off. And there will also be quite a few classes that we are going to miss in the mid to latter part of August. So no class next week, then we're going to have class. And then I believe there will be 1 or 2 classes we will be missing. I will be in Washington State on August 20th through 21st, as Cindy has posted. It's actually, I believe, August 19th through 21st. And if you guys are in the area and would like to get together, please let me know. I am on Facebook. You can contact me or Cindy Simons, who is organizing the event. And I may even be in British Columbia, Canada. So if you guys are in there, I hope you can make the tour, and I would love to meet you. So with that, I'm going to say good night, Laila Tov, and see you in 2 weeks. Shabbat Shalom.